You have such a rich, interesting history.
Literally, as a child, I would rather sit and listen to my mother talking to her friends than being out playing. You go to the counselor and they talked about, what would you like to do? And I said, I'm going to New York. The most important word and what is required the most is passion. History is so important as a part of the design. Try and avoid gimmicks. I see another arch or another this or another that. That was, 2025. I'm going to ask you a lot of questions. Hopefully you don't find it overwhelming, but that's how we get to know each other and how I get to know you, so I can create your interior, not mine.
We begin season 2 with a conversation that moves as gracefully as the man himself. Thomas Hamel is one of those rare figures whose influence feels both global and deeply personal. Raised in Virginia, trained in New York, and now long-rooted in Sydney, his work carries the quiet resonance of someone who's listened deeply to both space and self. His studio, Thomas Hamel Associates, is internationally recognised. But beyond the accolades, what defines Thomas is not scale, but soul. He has spent over 3 decades designing homes that are emotionally attuned, not just beautiful, but true. And now, through his mentorship program, he is shaping a new generation of designers to lead with the same integrity. In this episode, we explore the migrations that shape us across countries, creative chapters, and evolving callings. We talk about the early pull of design, the people who helped open doors, and the moments that asked him to choose depth over expansion. We speak about editing, not just in aesthetics, but in ambition, about the invisible thread that runs through a life well lived. This is not a conversation about design trends. It's about legacy, built quietly, but with great care. Welcome to season 2 of Build Beautiful. Let's begin. Thomas.
Thank you, Linda. I'm blushing. That was extraordinary. What a wonderful description.
Yeah, welcome. I'm so honoured to have you. You're launching our season 2, which is very exciting.
A great honour.
So for season 1, our inaugural season, we had Meryl Hare open she was the first episode, first guest.
A great way to begin.
A great way to begin, absolutely. But she mentioned you, and in that moment that she mentioned you, I thought, that's it. I have to have Thomas. He has to launch season 2.
Perfect.
A passing of the baton, if you will. So I'm very excited to have you.
Thank you.
You have such a rich, interesting history, and it all started in Virginia, in the south of America.
Yes.
And I'd love to go back there and understand what the influences are, because there's beautiful Georgian architecture, grand residences. How did that did it influence your pathway into design?
Yes, well, absolutely. It did influence my vision on the world, because I was a son of a Marine, so I grew up in military housing, but my mother was from New York originally, my father was from Boston, so they had that northern aesthetic, but living in the South was intriguing, but being on the military base, not quite as inspiring as I could have been. So I used my head and my imagination to become the design influence, because I was always interested in design. So fortunately, there's extraordinary colonial cities, because it was one of the first places that the British came to in the New World in the 1600s, so quite early. And so near us, quite close, was a place called Colonial Williamsburg, which was this amazing city that was the capital of Virginia until the 1780s, I think it was. And what was marvelous about it was that John D. Rockefeller had put enormous money into it in the 60s and renovated and restored this entire town. So it was a very realistic place to visit, and even down to the soft furnishings and how things work. So I was mesmerized by that from a very young age. There's a wonderful building there called the Governor's Palace, because it was the capital of the state, as I mentioned. So it was really fascinating to see how they would even, do summer loose covers on furnishings. And here I am, this little kid, noticing these things. God only knows how that happened, but I did. And it's interesting how it's stayed in my life, that whole concept of indoor-outdoor living and, the John Till nature of verandas and soft spaces and beautiful furniture and richly wax polished and all of those things that have stuck with me.
And those details, so you noticed at such a young age.
Yes.
Was anyone in your life a creative person?
No, I have no idea where it came from. But my mother was always very nurturing of that. And, 6 or 7. And one day I said to her, oh, one of these days I'm going to have an apartment in New York, Paris, and London at the same time. And she was like, how do you even know where those places are? It's fascinating.
That's
but it's
amazing.
just always just been in my heart and soul.
And so how did you move from Virginia to New York? Because you went to New York to study.
Yes.
So did you always, was that a seed that was planted because you read a magazine, or what was that transition point that you thought, this is the next stage of my life?
Fortunately, my mother, being from New York, had family and friends up there. So it was always planted my seed. And then we would take the weekend, the summer holiday drives to Boston to see my grandparents of my father's side. And I could see the city over there. And I'd beg everyone to please let me go and just experience it for a minute. But typically we'd drive by. So I knew that it was the apple that was in my eye. And so then when at the end of high school in Virginia, you go to the counselor and they talked about, what would you like to do? And I said, I'm going to New York. And I remember the lady distinctly saying, why would you do that? We have all the best schools in the world right here. And I was like, good. That's exactly why. I need concrete. I don't need green grass. I need that stimulation that I've been missing, that's just been in my imagination all these years.
And did you always know it was interior design?
I did.
You
Yes.
did?
Yes.
Wow.
And because my father would travel for a year at a time, being in the military, and spent a lot of time in Southeast Asia and Japan. So one year while he was away, I was able to start this passion that I had begun of making doll houses and miniature furniture. And so I had a china closet in my bedroom that I set up as rooms. And, I had a ballroom, and I'd make the chandelier out of fish hooks with pearls. And, my imagination always went wild with all of that. And so we were very anxious when he was coming back, from a year away to meet the sun. But he was extremely proud. And I used to think it was extraordinary that he would actually share it with his friends.
That's so beautiful.
Interiors were certainly always in my passion.
That's amazing. And so you went to New York and you studied design there. So what was that period of your life like?
It was eye-opener times 10 because it was the mid-'80s and New York was quite hot and big, and all the huge nightclubs and all of that side of things was extraordinary to be, a 17-year-old on his own. And I lived at the dormitories, and my bed actually looked at the Empire State Building. So it was quite an exciting time to be there. And I was at the Fashion Institute of Technology, which was, lots of fashion students, but also interior design as well. And so obviously they wanted all of us pretty young things in the clubs every night. So the free passes and so it was very hard, but I always stayed very true to myself that I was going to work hard, but experience those things as well. So I was very disciplined. I could, work, go out, come back to work, I was able to regulate all of that. But what was very interesting is with the school and going to New York, I had this passion for history as well as contemporary things. So it was nice to have that. I found that the school was a little bit too contemporary in its approach. Everything was Bauhaus and, streamline and all of that. So, but I had a very standout professor who was called Stanley Barrows, who to this day is known as a very great interior design history aficionado, and he studied at Parsons and then in New York. So he was one of the first to really influence me and see that history is so important as a part of the design education, and I use it as an example continually that, Picasso started doing very old-fashioned, old-school paintings, and he had to have that education. I went to a museum in Malaga this year, and they literally had one of Picasso's first paintings next to one of his last ones, and it's amazing to see that evolution of literally works, sitting next to each other. But I've always used as an example of how I feel people need to understand history before they can actually reinvent it and create something new.
And do you think with that connection to history, because your work is very much a balance of old and new.
Yes.
So do you think that was founded by that professor, that love for sort of weaving in history and elements that are maybe more traditional but in a contemporary context as well. Did that start there?
It absolutely planted the seed, yes. And so then, as the seeds started to sprout, it was interesting. After the 2 years in New York, which was extraordinary, I thought, because I always still had Europe I had been on a school trip a few years previously, so I knew what existed in London and Paris, so I felt like I needed to get back there. So after my 2-year degree, I was able to apply to a college in London to get my Bachelor of Fine Arts in interior design there. And that certainly really, started the sprouting of, because I actually felt the scale of London was more for me, that it wasn't so quite overwhelming and gritty. It had a finesse about it and a civilization to it. You just knew that you could scratch any surface and there was incredible things, hidden behind that. As we'll talk about all these amazing full circle sort of people that have come into my life and how it's informed and influenced me along the way. And by chance, one of my professors in New York had written me a letter of introduction to Sir Hardy Amies, who at the time was the gentleman who made all of the clothes for Queen Elizabeth. After Norman Hartwell, he became the couture for the Queen. And so I was able to be introduced and meet him in London, and he showed me and introduced extraordinary things to me. But in our discussions, as our friendship grew, we talked about Australia for some reason. And he said, I have a very great friend in Sydney called Leslie Walford, and I think that you should know of him. And so he wrote a letter of introduction, and I started this sort of correspondence with Leslie, which was so funny that Mel mentioned him as well as such an amazing Australian person. So at that point, Australia wasn't really on my map in my mind, but it was just such an intriguing thing. So when I was able to eventually arrive in Australia 10 years after that, we were able to become friends in the city itself.
Oh, what an amazing sort of connection and story, actually. Yes. And so how long were you in London for before you returned to New York?
I was in London for just over 2 years. And it was a fascinating time because the proximity of everything in Europe, as you know, is just so delightful. So, the professor would say, there's these amazing stained glass windows in Berlin. You should see that. Or you should go to the antique market in Brussels, or you should go to Vienna. And so you could literally do that.
On a train. Isn't that
and
amazing?
It was an amazing time at that time. The US dollar was almost equal to the pound. So it was a very inexpensive time. So it was marvelous to have those experiences. But then at that time, I also pushed. I didn't want to just become a classic designing interior designer. I still was intrigued by new and contemporary, but the mixture was always important. So as my thesis for my 2-year term there, it was a building on the river on the Thames called the Billingsgate Fish Market, which was an old Victorian building. And at the time, my professor told me that Richard Rogers was doing it as a office building. And so I was able to get the plans and have a meeting at Sir Richard Rogers' office, which was extraordinary. But then I thought, how do we make this contemporary? And having my experience of the nightclubs of New York, I decided that I was going to make this enormous building into a nightclub. Right. And first I came up with the name Londinium, which was the old Roman name for London. So I've always been intrigued with mixing the old and the new.
Yes, and it's still so apparent through your whole body of work when I look at it, is this beautiful balance of old and new and materiality and texture and pattern.
And reverence to the past. I think that's an important thing.
And do you think that is rooted in your upbringing in Virginia? Do you think there's a connection to that because you grew up there? I'm just trying to see if there is some sort of thread that runs through.
Somehow I certainly think there is. Because it's that combination of living with the past in a positive way. There's no need to disregard it or put your back, and turn your back against it. It's actually very nice to embrace it.
Oh, beautiful. And so you land back in New York and you start working at Parrish-Hadley. Tell me about that time working for Parrish-Hadley, and what did you have to give of yourself to that role and working in that environment, and what did you gain from it?
Thank you. Well, interesting. When I first got back to New York, I actually had two great sort of jobs in New York. The first one was for a lady called B.B. Winkler, who was, when we'd met by chance. And as I feel like I've always been so fortunate with these meetings of people, and how do you then sort of gain from it and embrace it. And so I've been very fortunate. And so literally I was working for a gentleman only for a few months because I wasn't as inspired by what he was doing. But I used to have to drive this lady, B.B. Winkler, to Long Island because we had done show house rooms next to each other. And hers was there, and I was at this other gentleman's room. And we just picked up this extraordinary dialogue and friendship in the car on an hour and a half each way, going to Long Island each weekend. And so by the end of the show house, I was working for her.
That's amazing.
And she was an extraordinary person because she was focused on design and loved it. And she had some extraordinary clients, but she was very business driven at the same time. So I feel very blessed and fortunate that I had her experience in my life, because I learned it's not all just art for art's sake.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's very important. And our most famous and amazing client was a man called B. Gerald Cantor and his wife Iris. And they had amassed the largest collection of Rodin sculptures in the world. At one point, they had 750 of them. Fascinating.
So where did they store them all?
People. Well, in the end, they gave away 500 or 600 to every museum in the world.
That's
so the Met and the LACMA and the Rodin Museum itself, and extraordinary people. And just to have that exposure.
Because can I just give some context? How old were you at this point that you were working for B.B. Winkler?
Maybe 21 or 22.
You are an old soul, Thomas Hamel. You really are, because I think at 21 or 22, and how old would B.B. have been at that time? Maybe
50s.
50s.
Yes.
So this beautiful connection that struck up between I remember what I was like at 21. I mean, it is extraordinary. And that's the one of the first things when I met you, I want to say about 10 years ago now, is you strike me as this, you are so present. And I'll talk about that. I have a little story about that, which I'll mention later. But you are an old soul.
Yes.
And it's so... it's so obvious through this just the beginning of this conversation.
Yeah, well, literally as a child, I would rather sit and listen to my mother talking to her friends than being out playing. That's how I feel like I learned about people themselves.
Do you have siblings?
I have one brother.
One brother. And are you close in age or?
He's 2 years younger. Unfortunately, he died during COVID. So,
yes, I'm so sorry.
That's
I remembered that.
Yeah,
yes.
But we were very different. So again, it was in my DNA.
It's just in your
very
DNA.
Different
That's
people.
Amazing.
But yes, and then with BB, she gave such stock to me that, literally I had 2 assistants myself at 21, 22, and we did extraordinary projects. But it was that exposure to what the world offered, and these great collectors and these great visionary people that had, extraordinary things and passion, which I'll bring back up again later as well. So it was an amazing time.
Can we stay with BB for a minute?
Yes.
Because I love the business of design.
Yes.
And I was going to talk about this later, but I think we'll sit here for a moment. What were the key things that you learnt from her? Because I think one of the things that I know a lot of people who will listen to this podcast, many designers, architects, they not always struggle, but one of the big things that they're trying to focus on is building a strong business. So to have that exposure at 21, to have an insight into the business of design, what are the key things that you learned and that you've kept with you to build your own practice? I would immediately say it's organization and structure. So process and structure. It's got to be, you just can't, think, I'm going to design this and I'll think about what it costs later. And, everything has to be structured and organized, because as long as you give them all the information up front, most clients are, at least then, correctly, if it's something that they're interested in, want to proceed with or not. Right. Okay. And then it's all about the efficiency of, the descriptions, the details, the cost,
how it's then invoiced, how it's that structure that's so crucial. And it's much more easy these days. There's programs that can assist with all that. At that point, there weren't. We had to fill out very detailed worksheets for every single item, and how the sofa is going to be piped, and is it got blind stitching, and it's just setting up those systems. So fortunately, I've always had a very organized and and a very logistic focused mind, which is crucial. So I'm fortunate that I've got the creativity side of things, but that organizational side of things. While with BB, I met one of the people that has changed and influenced my entire life. And it's a hilarious story how we met. BB mentioned that this lady was coming in to see us, who was a German industrialist who had a pied-à-terre in New York. And she had seen our work in a magazine and wanted to talk to us. In walked this extraordinary person in a suit and tie with slicked back hair and red lips, just like that look that you just think of from many years ago, German, just that severity, but yet
hard-edged.
But yes, and then she ended up, she had steel mills around the world. And so imagine being, it was her family's steel company that she was running. To have that masculinity and femininity combined was fascinating. And she loved bright reds and jewel colors and things. So literally the first day, BB was a very feminine lady. So I think she was intrigued by that. But we're walking down the street and she said to me, Thomas, she said, what do you put in your hair? Because at that point I used to slick back my hair when it was humid in New York in the summer days. She said, I need that because I don't have time or like washing my hair. I'd like some of your gel. What do you use? And so I explained that I used to buy this gel in New York in London. And so then the following day, I brought in a tin of it and wrapped in a ribbon, and I had it delivered to her hotel at the time. And she called me immediately and said, when can we go to dinner?
Oh, and that's amazing.
We became such extraordinary friends. And what she taught me, and I'll never forget it, is because she talked about that. She said, most people make the mistake of starting in the center and working their way around the circle, trying to experience the world. She said, that's silly. You should start with the big exploration of the world and come down to where you want to be at the end of it, in the center of the circle rather than going the other direction. And we remained friends even after I came to Australia. So in the end, because BB didn't even know it, but I got out of her that she actually had this extraordinary moated castle in the Netherlands. And then after that, she bought a castle in Scotland. And then after that, when I was able to assist her with an apartment in Singapore. And then she bought this 18th century palace in Potsdam that she was doing. So I was able to assist her with that. And then after she discovered the New World via me, she bought an island off the south coast of New Zealand that we ended up doing things for. So she's been visionary in my life, all from my bottle of hair gel in New York when I was 22.
And I was going to tell this story later, but I'm going to tell it now. My first experience with you, because it speaks to this point about you and it highlights it. I met you, I was a guest of our mutual friend Lorraine's. It was an art gallery event 10 years ago at Art House Gallery. And I was introduced to you, and it was full of people. It was dark, it was loud, and you were completely present in that conversation. And honestly, you have taught me. No, truly. And it stayed with me because I thought, little old me, I mean, who am I? And you're Thomas Hamel, you're a design hero. And that, you know what they say, never meet your heroes. But in my case, I meet you and you were completely present. And you were not just present in the conversation, and you could have easily been looking around. It was distracting. There were people everywhere.
It's overwhelming, those kind of functions.
Those things are overwhelming. And it was one of the first, things that I had gone to at an art gallery and it was a long dinner and there was all sorts of things happening. But not only were you present with me, you were engaged in the conversation and asking me questions.
Well, I spend a lot of time asking questions, and I always apologize to new clients because I said, I'm going to ask you a lot of questions, and hopefully you don't find it overwhelming, but that's how we get to know each other and how I get to know you, so I can create your interior, not mine.
Not yours. So I just wanted to highlight that story. I was going to tell that story later, but it's so relevant to you've struck this beautiful friendship with this lady who is, a boss.
Exactly.
But you connected with her, and that is exactly my experience with you 10 years ago. And that's your superpower. Yeah,
well, and I've been so fortunate with many experiences like that, but she was one of the highlights. I thought I should share that story.
Incredible. I feel like you should write a novel.
Yes.
I think you could write a novel.
Well, fortunate, because my first year in New York, I didn't take or make many notes. And I realized, what did I do last year? Everything, but I don't remember it. So I've kept diaries since the middle of 80s since then. So I do, luckily there is a documentation of all of the extraordinary experiences that I've had.
And we'll continue to unfold some of these experiences. So B.B. Winkler.
Yes, she was extraordinary. But one of my assistants had left us, and because we did work extraordinary hours, so she went on to get this wonderful job at Parrish-Hadley, and I was listening to her path and enjoying the changes in her life now that she was at Parrish-Hadley, which I knew of them obviously because they were so well regarded in New York as the blue blood sort of special firm, but at the same time they always nurtured other designers. It wasn't just about the egos of Mrs. Parrish and Mr. Hadley. They had other designers, and they let them have a voice in the business, which was nice. So all of a sudden, one day, a call out of the blue, and she said, "Run, don't walk. They need somebody at Parrish-Hadley today. They have this new job in Bermuda, and please get here quick." Wow. And I did. And I was hired as the assistant to Brian McCarthy, who now has his own successful company in New York. And it was a turning point. It was extraordinary. It was very difficult to break my bond with BB because we're extremely close. But I did, and it was worthwhile. And all of a sudden, it started to teach me about doing more overseas and more projects, not just in New York itself. Because as I said, I started with this job in Bermuda, which was extraordinary. And it was a mixture of bringing the best Georgian and English furniture to a tropical island, and mixing it in a bohemian kind of way. It was fascinating. So it was a great project. And it was extraordinary because Mrs. Parrish and Mr. Hadley were both with us then, and to work with both of them is, most people just, now you just read about them and think, how did that truly happen? Mrs. Parrish was much more about keeping things, more old school, but it was about beauty and quality of things, but then mixing it with baskets and with objet trouvé and quilts and things. So to bring down the glamour and the grandeur of things, that was her sort of point of view, whereas Albert Hadley was very much, I saw myself in him as he was a very gentle soul from Nashville, Tennessee, who was very gracious and always, a very much a Southern gentleman. So it was lovely to have him as a role model from an early age. But he brought a modernist approach to things. And that's what I still find it so intriguing, that frisson that you need, the yin and the yang of the old school and the new things. And so he would always push the limits. One of the summer, because Mrs. Parrish would go to Maine every summer to her holiday home, and he used that time to redo our lobby. And it was, I recall it was silver foil walls and yellow curtains and a 1960s lamp. And, it was quite something. And then I had the opportunity of being in the lobby when she walked in the first time. Oh, and her eyes just went up and she said, "This is ghastly. What has happened?" So, but I think that was the magic of Parrish-Hadley, that they were able to work together a way.
Yeah.
The tension was brilliant. And that's why you could just see these interiors that were fresh, but yet old school at the same time. So I felt that was such an extraordinary experience. And then he being such a soft-spoken gentleman, he would always be sent on the missions with the most difficult clients because everyone figured he's going to be the best way of softening the situation when there's an issue or making a big vision. So me being the youngest in the group, I was typically, the one standing there writing the notes and being with him. So it was a marvelous exposure yet again.
I just feel like we're on these stepping stones of greatness that you've had the privilege of being able to learn from. And
very much so. And that's why I know that it's not as easy to have those occasions now for young and for people studying. Don't even have to be young, but just for anyone who's interested in design. So that's why I do try and share as much of my experience and interest with anyone who's interested in listening.
Yes, and you are, over the years, I've heard you speak many times, and you are so generous with your knowledge and your storytelling, and you're so open actually, not just about the stories, but about how you run your practice and how you do things. And I think we owe you a great debt of gratitude because we need those examples. And I think that's part of why Build Beautiful for me is such a passion project, because it's those stories, it's being able to learn from people that we wouldn't otherwise have access to. So
it's so important. I just find, you can read a book and that's fine, but it's those interactions and how people react with each other and how Albert used to get his way with the most demanding ladies on earth, and who are all known for their style and that they were icons themselves. Right. So how do you subtly, gently massage, convey your ideas and actually get results.
And do you think you've learnt that lesson and you actually implement that yourself?
Very much so.
Yeah.
Yes. It wasn't an obvious learning. I don't remember a day saying, "Oh, now I know how to do it." It was a very subliminal thing, but it's
that
always
exposure, isn't it? It's so nuanced. And so at what brought you to, I'm trying to get us to Sydney,
it's a long journey.
I'm very excited
There's a lot of stories along the way.
Absolutely, and I don't want to rush the stories. So, but at some point we need to arrive to Sydney. So you take us there when you're ready, but I am curious about that transition from New York life and working at such an established firm and then making a decision to I think it's at least 10,000 miles away.
And miles, not kilometers.
Miles, not kilometers, that's right.
Well, this next story will lead us to Sydney, but through an intriguing journey again. So Brian and I there was an extraordinary antique store called Stair & Company on the corner of Madison Avenue, and they were having a Friday night soiree, and I was there, and this lady was behind us and overheard us speaking something, mentioning Mrs. Parrish, and it was literally like we were rock stars, and she was this groupie who had just met us, and we started a dialogue with her. It was fascinating. And she said, "Oh, I'm just a simple farmer's wife from California. But, I've always been intrigued by design, and Mrs. Parrish is my pinup and da-da-da-da-da." So Brian had to go off to something, and I spent more time with her. And I said, "By chance, are you here for the weekend? I'm free on Saturday, if you wanted to go and, look at more showrooms or something." And so we ended up having this great weekend chatting to each other. And on Monday morning, I went in with Brian to Mrs. Parrish and said, "This intriguing lady, it would be extraordinary if you could meet her. What do you think?" And Mrs. Parrish wasn't always the softest, warmest, fuzziest person, but she was intrigued. And so this lady came in her name was Carol Harris. And what we found out is that it was not only a little farmer, but she owned most of the beef in California in this extraordinary place called River Ranch. And boom, all of a sudden, Mrs. Parrish was flying on the large private jet to California, and then getting on the smaller private jet to get to the ranch. And so this story started. Yes.
And this is all because you took a minute to have a conversation, which is what you do.
And then I pushed it further and spent the whole afternoon with her in New York.
Intuition.
It's just
mind-blowing.
And they're not always those kind of successful things like that. It doesn't matter to me. But you get to learn new things about people. So the story chapter moves on. We started working for Mrs. Harris in California, and I had another trip. It was literally my first trip to California ever with Brian after that, and she was showing us lovely things in Los Angeles before we went up to the ranch. But so later on, there's a great antique fair called the Biennale in Paris that was every 2 years, and it was considered the best in the world at the time. And so Brian and I were going to be there. We were going to go and see the German industrialist. I didn't mention her name, but at that point she was called Dr. Viola Hallman. Later on, she became the Princess of Hohenzollern, and when we did the palace in Potsdam. But we were going to visit her and go to this antique fair. So at another gallery in Paris called Vidiaron, we were there, and all of a sudden came this Australian contingency. This gentleman called Martin Cook, who was a great antique dealer here in Sydney, and he was with Frank Grill, who was one of the great interior designers of Sydney at the time. We picked up a conversation, and they invited me to dinner that night with them. And Martin had a great collector called David Roche from Adelaide, who now, when David passed, they started the David Roche Foundation, and it's a beautiful decorative arts museum in the center of Adelaide. So I met all of those that first night in Paris, and that was it. And we had a beautiful dinner, and Martin told me of some other antique galleries that I didn't know. So Brian and I went and saw those the next day, and it became a nice education of that. Martin was on his way to New York on the way back to Australia. I didn't know how those sort of round-the-world tickets worked at that point, but he was stopping by New York, and we were able to have another evening together. And he said, "Why don't you come to Sydney? At Christmas time. Let's organize if you can come." So I was able to get 10 days to 2 weeks off, which was the full year, holiday.
That's right.
In the US. And so I came so that was 1990, and so Martin was an extraordinary host. I literally, after 2 weeks, I had to write 45 thank you notes, because on the plane home, I was just spinning. My head was spinning because, at that point, I'd met Malcolm and Lucy Turnbull, before he was the prime minister, and extraordinary people. And interior design-wise, Frank Grill was here. And then I met Michael Love, who's become a great friend ever since. And my eyes were opened. And I wrote back to all of my friends in New York, and I said, "It's London in the sun. I think this is the place." And Martin is certainly the most debonair, extraordinary person to spend time with. So I was hooked. And then you get back to New York, and it was January, it was rainy, it was miserable, cold, and all of those things. Yeah. And so we talked about, potentially me moving to Australia at some point. And, I went to some of the Parrish-Hadley clients, and they were aghast. How could you leave here for that? It didn't quite have the polished reputation that Australia has now. It was intriguing to everyone, but it felt like it was the last stop on the train. It wasn't, going to the bright lights. But I certainly thought it was extraordinary. And so it took quite a while to get the immigration organized and the residency and things, but I was able to come maybe 7 months later.
Amazing.
And once I arrived in Australia, then we were like, well, now what are you going to do? I just left this extraordinary job in New York, and what's next? And luckily through Martin and his antique store, I met everyone who was, of note in Sydney, Lady Potters and Lady Porters and Lady Packers, and it was extraordinary for all of that. The who's who. But then I was a little unknown identity at that point. I was 25, and I wasn't really ready to start my own business. But we talked about it and said, yes, well, why not? What do you have to lose? And so we Incorporated. And Michael Love was an extraordinary friend, but it was just, he never offered to do a collaboration or anything until I started my own business. Right. And then as soon as I did that, he actually did. And it was all about that thing that I feel like I brought to Australia and that was required, is that service and that turnkey service. And he had been asked to do that for the first time, and didn't quite know what that all mean, filling the fridge and buying the candles and the towels and doing all of that. So he brought me in on this project, and it was almost like him putting his arms around me and giving me the gravitas, in that I was somebody in Sydney that was respected for that, and it went from there.
That's amazing, because I mean, really, that is Thomas Hamel Associates. It is a turnkey service.
Yes,
and so you were able to bring all that experience that you'd had working in New York here, and almost said, I mean, it's an incredible offering.
Yes.
So how was it received, and how did that first project go? And then was that essentially the foundation of your business moving forward?
It was one of them for sure, and it was very well received. It was a very special person called Paul Ramsey, and it was an apartment in the city, and he loved beautiful things and living that way, but how do you start and where do you start? And so Michael and I spent a lot of time, and it was wonderful because we could find special objects, and it was about trying to create a story for him, which we always try to do for every client. And it was successful. And at the same time, the Turnbulls, who I had met socially, they were living at Good Hope. The Turnbulls at that time were living in Paddington and planning, eventually to move into a waterfront house in Point Piper, which, funny enough, they just invited me. It was 30 years ago this year that we did the house for them there.
That's amazing.
And it's so nice to still be a part of, people's lives and history. But the business just kept going on that respect. And then what happened is all of a sudden Melbourne came into it. And so I can't remember, there was a couple of them. It's funny that right now they all sort of claim I was the first Melburnian, and I just smile at all of them.
You're so gracious.
Yes, I think the first one was actually a beautiful lady called Margaret Darling, and she had an apartment in very, very old school, proper, and I was able to help her with a renovation in Domain Road. But besides that, a couple of others had also reached out to me. And I think I was able to be accepted in Melbourne because I wasn't, a true New South Wales person. So it was
so that rivalry is true between
big time, but in a nice way. It makes me smile, and I think I love being between both cities. I think it's so special. But that was a whole nother chapter, because the interiors and the homes are very different between the two cities. And down in Melbourne, it's very much about the garden and entertaining at home and scale. It's so nice to see, 3 and 4 meter ceilings versus 2.4 to 2.7. It's just a whole nother lifestyle. So I enjoy.
So when you did come to Sydney and to Australia, were there any frustrations? Because we were such a small market, at least back then.
Yes.
Certainly different now.
Yeah, it was certainly a culture shock in many ways. Besides everyone being charming and nice, it was the New Yorker at that time, was bigger, better. It was, the late 80s there, where anything was go. And so I remember we'd go to new projects, and you'd always just calculate that it was $10,000 a window for window treatments, dun, 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 dun. And I remember coming here, and I mentioned the word 10,000, and that was for the entire budget. so it was a treat. And I'll never forget the fur, because for people that don't know what a check is, but I used to love getting the checks in the mail. And the first one did a custom bookcase for a lovely American lady in Mossman, and the cabinetry was $5,000. And
back that then, was in the 90s.
I was shaking with the check as I walked into the bank. But at the same time, I did love being here. And there's a an appreciation that Australian clients have that I've always found very refreshing. And people are interested and intriguing. And now I know that literally, because I find Australians are the most curious on earth. Literally, the showrooms in New York or London or Los Angeles don't change, every couple of years. But yet we've been there 3 times and we're always looking for the next thing because we are so used curious, to, new things and being stimulated.
That's right. And I think that's just by nature of being so far away. Yes. So we have to open our minds and have that curiosity.
Yes, and we make a great deal of effort to do it. It's refreshing.
So I want to go back and sort of talk about this old world and new world, because you have said that you feel like you're a bridge between the two. So that thread, it feels like it runs through all of your work.
Yes.
When you're working on a project, is there a formula that you follow, or is it an intuition? How do you marry those two forms of thinking so beautifully?
I typically start with, as I mentioned, lots of questions and trying to delve into a person's appreciation, their mind, what they would like the end results to be, because it's very much, I say to them, you're putting on your clothes, not mine. I want you to feel very comfortable in this environment when it's completed. And at the same time, especially through Albert Hadley, architecture has to speak, and it's got to be appropriate to the interiors and vice versa. They have to work together in some way. So it's very important. So I'm very much informed by
the architecture,
what it is. Yes, but then then once you get that established, then you make the twists. There's an extraordinary gentleman called John Schaefer, who I met very early on, and he was a great collector of everything, and it worked a lot with Martin. And so I used to just go on Saturdays, and we just move paintings around. And at that point, he had this extraordinary collection of Rupert bunnies and all of these wonderful Victorian art. And he just purchased a great Victorian Gothic house called Rona in Bellevue Hill. And he didn't understand or have any inkling about interior design or decoration. But I knew that becoming friend and talking with him and I spend a lot of time building confidence with clients. And
their confidence?
Yes, it's very important.
And how do you do that? Is that just through education?
Yes, and patience and discussion and just sort of understanding. And that it took quite a while with him because he was just about buying objects, but he didn't know how to put all those objects together. And so through my New York connections, I was able to show him these beautiful, Gothic rugs, antique rugs that, Victorian rugs that you could find in New York, and beautiful furniture. But then at the same point, I said to him, you've got to put some contemporary things in there. You can't just have it as an homage to the Victorian era. It doesn't work, you need that. And as an example, I was just at Chatsworth recently up in Northern England, and it's extraordinary how they have this incredible collection of antiques, but they embrace contemporary art and they mix it. And so I spend a lot of time talking with him about that, and I do that with other people as well, that it's nice to have one or two old souls in a room, but then it's got to have the twist.
Absolutely. It needs to be dynamic in a way.
Yes. And appropriate for now.
Yes, exactly. You said something beautiful. We had a call last week, and you said, I live by being in other people's heads. I live for being in other people's heads. I think that was the words that you used. Yes. And I love that. Can we just expand on that? Because, we've touched on it, but what did you mean when you said that?
It's interesting. In a way, it's almost, rather than having my own points of view, I actually try and emphasize their points of view. And so I find that that's the best way and I like the mix of bringing people together that have like minds. I was eventually able to introduce my German industrialist to John Schaefer, and they became fast friends and went to the antique fairs in Maastricht together. So that gives me pleasure in being able to be a part of someone's life. And I think that's how I can have so many points of view that are different as well. So each person has this whole, and I quite appreciate and enjoy bringing it out of them and having it so it becomes a part of my psyche as well, in a way.
I'm really interested in this because, working with lots of clients, it can often, I often say your cup has to be full
Absolutely.
to be able to give to them and to absorb what they need and their needs. How do you balance that? Because you are so present when you're with someone, whether it's, that's been my experience with you. So how do you ensure your cup is full so that you can be completely present with your client?
Yes.
What is that magic touch that you have? Like, what are you doing that way?
It takes a lot out of me. So I do need that recharge time where I have to have my own sort of day of, recharge. And I'm fortunate enough to have this beautiful garden now that I can spend time in for that. But I'm very much a generous giver. I enjoy it. And I don't know, I'm sure it's, if I went to some analysis, they'd say, I'm hiding behind everyone else rather than being the strong, person myself. But I don't think I need that.
I think you're amazing. Have you ever sort of worked with a client? I guess I'd like to understand if you've ever had a challenging client in that perhaps you don't like the aesthetic, or how have you dealt with a situation that perhaps is grating against you in the wrong way?
Yes.
Have you had that situation, and how have you dealt with it?
It happens, unfortunately, because as I've just been saying, I give. So there's times that I've given too much, and, some people don't want that, and they don't want their home to be that. I don't know what they exactly want, but they don't want to go to that level and layers and details. And so it's frustrating for me, so some clients we can get to a certain stage and then that's fine. And they're not the ones that I'll be corresponding with 20 and 30 years later, like most of the ones that, I do. But, and then obviously there are the ones that are too difficult to continue with. And the only breaking point that I have is if they're sort of awful or rude to my team, because those are my babies, and that's a breaking point. That doesn't work. So, unfortunately, it doesn't happen very often.
It strikes me that you're such a gentle person that I can't imagine it would happen often, but. Life is life, and
it does take a lot out of me because
I was going to say, do you take it?
I take it personally. Yes, of course.
Of course. I mean, we're human, right?
Yes.
But I guess also being in practice for so many years, you also have to. I imagine you have to learn to have a sense of decompartmentalization, maybe, or just because often it's not about you or I, and it's a reflection of the person, but that can be challenging because we're all about people.
Exactly.
And so making sure they're happy is our purpose in life.
That's what, as I've heard other guests that you've spoken with say, to get those happy messages, to get the thank yous, to get the pictures and say, look at what you've done for us. That's what we get up for in the morning.
Exactly. Yes. Absolutely. It is exactly why we do it. How do you know when a space is just right? When you're curating a space, how do you know you've got it just right? Or how far do you push the envelope? At what point do you go, enough is enough? It's perfect. Is it ever perfect?
Well, that's what I was just going to say. It's not easy because my relationships go on forever. So something can be just right one day, and then 3 days or 3 years later, it's not. And so I want things to evolve. And I'm always saying to clients, let's move the artworks around, because you stop looking at things. So that's why I don't like a just right, because then you don't actually appreciate it or look at it anymore. I want things to continue to evolve. Then it reaches the point, though, sorry to interrupt. It reaches the point, though, then they get twofold. So that's so then I go and I sneak things in the drawers. And then when I come back, the things are stuck out of the drawers, and then they go back in the drawers. I've got a few clients where that's our game.
I love it. But I love that. I mean, that speaks a lot to your importance of relationship.
Yes.
Because the fact that you're still in their lives 3 months, 3 years, 10 years later, 3 decades later, and that there's this relationship, you're there as part of their being, as opposed to I offer a service, I do a service, I close that door and I move on.
Yes.
It's a really different way of operating, which I think I don't know many people that.
No, it's and it
so
started
special.
from day one when I talked about the service. Yeah, it was. I've certainly seen over my 3 decades here the evolution of service amongst many other designers that didn't exist. And it's become, it's part of the it's important now that that's included.
Well, it's your DNA, and it's actually what makes it's the value of Thomas Hamel Associates.
Very
it's
much so.
Really the
And then I've tried very hard with my team to instill that, so it's not just me that's offering that. That service and that dedication and that interest. Everyone, we're all about developing relationships.
Yeah, I want to jump over to your book. Which you published in 2010, which I have right here.
Very much time for another one, but sorry.
I think it's still very relevant, and I studied it like I did Meryl Hare's book.
Yes.
But I want to talk about the book because I'd like to understand, and the book is called Residence. What was the vision at the time of doing the book? And there's 2 things I want to unpack. Is one, what was the vision for the book and how did it come about? But then I also want to talk about what was your vision for the business and what you saw that Thomas Hamel Associates could be, because I know there was this tension play between conquering the world versus, to use your words, sticking to your knitting.
Yes.
And I'd love to kind of talk about those 2 sides of that coin.
Okay.
Because I think there's something really interesting and special in the way you've chosen to grow and build your business, because there are you would have had lots of opportunities to do lots of things.
Yes.
So can we start there?
It's a big subject.
It's a big subject.
But a very special one.
Yes.
It literally started with a great friend called Robin Holt, who had been editor of Vogue Living, and then she'd moved overseas and she was working for Condé Nast in Russia and in the UK after that. And she came back to Australia and she said, I'm here and I want to do new and interesting things. I'd like to give you a couple days a week. What could we do? And I said, well, it's time to think of a book, and who better to have the beginnings start with? It would be you, Robin. So we started that journey, and before, certainly as said, it's 15 years old now. So the business was still in its infancy a bit, but we did have enough beautiful projects at that point to showcase. So we went about finding the right photographer, and the words were the most difficult part, because I truly wanted the book to be my story and me speaking, but obviously it couldn't be me writing it. So it took 3 authors, and we found a very special lady who I think did a brilliant job, and she speaks from my heart with her words in such a clever way. So I still enjoy reading back, and because each chapter was about that journey with that client and the stories. The one, we were in Melbourne, and the little baby could only sleep on the tram tracks when we were driving. So we'd drive around Melbourne, and I just, all those stories that I love keeping alive in my mind and in the clients' minds. It was quite one of the first, obviously very few Australian design books in the world at that time that reached the world. So we had to push ourselves so we had launches in Los Angeles and New York and London. And I was able to use all of the great friends that I had built up over the time in the network to have these beautiful venues. And we sent the books ourselves and did a lot of the work ourselves. But it was such a great time to rekindle all of the friendships that I had around the world. Because what had developed here, which was fascinating, is that most people, foreigners, when they come to Sydney, Martin and I were quite high on the list of please call. Yes. And so I had the most extraordinary experiences like that, Barbara Barry, I sat next to at a dinner from Los Angeles. John Saladino, who literally was in the floor above Parrish-Hadley in New York, but I was always too scared to talk to him in the lift. All of a sudden, I was touring him around in Melbourne and then being invited to his home in Connecticut and later in Montecito. And then it just happened. And then in London, to have David Hicks that we took out to breakfast and then to dinners. And then Jane Churchill and Nina Campbell and all these people I think I actually met more people living in Sydney than I would have in New York, and to be able to develop these friendships. So it was sort of like the perfect time to celebrate all of those by having them in London and New York with me and doing
for the launch of the book.
For the launches, yeah. And then to your question about what vision I had for the book and for my future, I must say at that point, I was very much about conquering the world, like we all go through that stage.
Yes.
And it was a dinner in Los Angeles with Barbara Barry, and she asked everyone at the table to say what they saw for themselves in 5 years' time. And came to me and I thought, well, I'm seeing stores, London, Paris, New York. I'm seeing this, I'm seeing furniture collections and fabric collections and all of that. And she just put her eyebrow up and said, okay, I look forward to hearing in 5 years, how has this all evolved? And it evolved over the next year or two after that all of a sudden we were working on a furniture collection where I thought, goodness, I'm going to spread myself too thin. I'm this personal person. I want to, because then I would go to these showroom events and I would try and give me to everyone, and that's impossible. So I realized that I have to be careful that, I can't be that generous of myself continually, that
well, something has to give, doesn't it?
Exactly.
And you have to decide what is it that lights you up.
Yes.
But I love the line that you said, stick to your knitting.
Yes.
I was like, I love that line. That's a quotable, stick to your knitting. I hadn't ever heard it before, but I've really pondered it since our last conversation. And I think for me it's because it's easy to want to grow.
Yes.
I'm an ambitious person. I'm constantly I think it's an easy choice to want to, especially off the back of the book, to want to have
take over everything.
Take over the world.
Yes.
And so I think it's a much harder decision to actually decide what is my core value, what is my core strength, and then I'm going to stay in this lane.
Yes.
Because there's always a trade-off.
Very much, yeah.
And so I guess I would like to understand, what was that thinking at that point that you just thought, yes, you'll spread yourself too thin, but was it that you just thought, that's not my wheelhouse. I want to really focus on delivering these incredible experiences, because they're not just, it's not a service, it's an experience.
No, absolutely.
It's a Thomas Hamel experience.
Well, and I call it a journey.
A journey,
yes, and it's very part of the, everyone's like, when can we go overseas? What can we do this? What can we spend time together?
Yeah.
That makes me smile. But at the time, I was spending a lot of time with Martin Lawrence Ballard, who's a great friend in Los Angeles, and then with seeing what Barbara had created of her business. And I saw that is a potential for business, but it's a little bit more, they're selling this vision in an anonymous kind of way. It's not as personal as I typically like to be. So I just decided that, no, that's not what I need to do. Let's focus on these extraordinary jobs and these extraordinary clients. And they continue to give me amazing jobs and feedback, and and the global had come from all these Australian clients. All of my overseas jobs are for Australians or someone with a very strong Australian connection. So I was able to do my work in Asia and in America and all around Europe for Australians. And I love that. I thought that's what I'm going to stick to and be strong at.
You've really carved out that niche.
Yes.
You are, that's what you're known for. And so I think, but it's so lovely and refreshing to hear that you chose depth over scale, essentially. Yes. Yeah, I love that. I want to move on to mentorship, because I mean, you've mentioned all these incredible people that have touched you over the years through your journey. And I know that you now give back and you have a mentorship program.
Yes.
When did that when did this idea of the mentorship program start, and why did you decide to introduce it?
Well, we've always worked with the schools to have people in our offices from the schools, because I just think the exposure is so important. Literally, they don't teach anything about fabrics in any design courses, and it's just so crucial. And
you might get one lesson.
It's very sad.
It's
and
sad.
I literally, in New York, before my job with BB, I ironed samples in a showroom, just like every other designer should do, because that's how you learn. So I always have people in our library. I think that's important. But I thought, well, let's take it to the next step. And so, because the problem is then the poor things, they're in the library and they don't get to hear any of the interactions or the other things that are part of, this big picture that's being an interior designer. So we started so it was probably about 5 years ago we started it. And of course, the first year, of course, there were too many amazing sort of people, so they keep me out of the selection until the very end because they know I'll just say, come all.
You're so loving and generous.
So, but even in the first year, I ended up saying, let's have two.
Oh.
So they're both very special people, and it's been wonderful to see them spend a couple of years with us in the office, and then they've gone on and they're actually working for other Sydney interior designers, and I've heard great congratulations from those designers of what we were able to expose these gentlemen to.
It's incredible. It's really a giving back, isn't it? In many ways, it's your way of giving back. Do many stay on with you?
Yes.
Or
so, typically, they start that way, but then at the same time, it's like having children. It must be so difficult to actually sort of
let them go.
Say that they need to learn, something else as well.
Absolutely.
But it's a big family tree in Sydney of all of the designers that have worked with us.
That's right.
It's makes me very proud.
Very. It's a beautiful community too, actually, and it's lovely to see people. I had a beautiful junior designer who worked with me for about a year, and she went off to Squillace, and she's doing great things there, and it's really nice to kind of see them grow, and it's an important part of the cycle of our community. So let's talk about exposure. How does one educate themselves? Because it is. I studied as an adult. I went to a private college. I studied design. We did maybe 2 lessons on history. It's just not enough. So what would your recommendation be for someone who does want to extend their repertoire, extend their knowledge? What is the best way to do that for designers or architects or just design aficionados?
It's so much more easy now in terms of with social media. There are some incredible Instagram and accounts especially that people, most of them are based in New York or London, that actually do talk about all the famous interiors and the designers and the parties that they gave and all of those things. So it'd be nice. I should actually put together a list of
would be amazing.
Those amazing Instagram sites that are, because they do have extraordinary stories on them, and that's the best way of learning.
Because it's how do you learn? And also I think, I'm not an expert at all in antiques. I have very little knowledge in antiques.
Yes.
How do you know you're looking at a quality
it's a whole
antique?
Nother chapter, exactly.
Or, a vintage piece. And I think we have some great people in Sydney who have vintage stores or antique stores, but it's slim pickings.
Slim, no.
You shy away from that because it's so limited.
Exactly.
The knowledge is limited. So whereas your work is so rich with that, it's so layered. How do we educate ourselves? And I would love that Instagram list, and I'll share it with everybody through the socials.
That would be a good thing to do.
But how do we educate ourselves? How do we learn and extend our repertoire?
Yes, it's tricky, and then there are platforms now like First Dibs and things to learn from. But literally, I say to my team so often, you can't just buy something from a picture, and if it's got to be a picture in a room or live, because these sort of deceiving photographs, and it's happened to all of us. You think you're buying a vase this big and it comes this big.
That's right.
It's just so I tell them continually to pull out the tape measure and just actually make sure that this is what
in
they're
fact,
getting.
I've heard you say that, and I've said that to my team. We've got to pull out the tape measure, check, measure everything.
It happened recently. client was looking at this extraordinary painting, and it was advertised and we all said it's beautiful and all that.
Yeah.
I went to the gallery to look at it. It was literally a postage stamp for many tens of thousands of dollars.
Oh, gosh,
you have to be so careful.
That's right. Exactly.
Measures are very important. But back to your question about how do you learn, it is just looking and exposure. There's no black and white things. Nobody wants to sit and read textbooks, and understand it all. So it's exposure and seeing things. Yes.
And then on your travels, how do you, you've been traveling for such a long time and you're so well connected, but if someone was going to New York or London, what would they be looking for in terms of places to go to? I often ask questions and I'll send messages to people on Instagram and say, you were just in London. Can you give me a list of where you went and what the, what the hit list is? And that's for me been the best way to kind of extend myself.
And I spend a whole nother hat that I wear is information bureau.
I know,
but I do it with pleasure because both the clients and friends and colleagues, I'm always giving lists of what to do. But makes me know that I've got to stay current and up to date as well because it changes so much. I haven't spent as much time in New York in the past couple of years, so I'm losing my the finger on the pulse of New York.
But you're in LA a lot.
Yes.
Is there a marked difference between LA and New York?
Very much so. Yes, but LA works much. I much prefer to bring clients, Australian clients, to LA because the showrooms relate to our homes here.
Yes.
It's light and it's open and all of that, and they have indoor trees and it feels. Whereas everything in New York's on the 17th floor crammed into a showroom, it doesn't relate to our life as much. So
very different.
It is very much a part of my journey to bring clients to Los Angeles and San Francisco sometimes as
it's one flight as well, which is nice and easy.
And we can then follow up because half the day they're on our time zone. So it actually is much easier that way as well.
We're coming to the end of our beautiful conversation. I have some reflection questions I'd like to ask you.
Okay.
And I think we have to do a part 2. There's just still so much to talk about. You're amazing. When you think about the next chapter, what excites you about?
What's really exciting to me is that now I've got employees who've been with me 10, 15, 20 years. And I just think that's so marvelous. It makes me so proud. But at the same time, always still nurturing the younger ones as well. But I feel like that I'm leaving a legacy of various educated, interested people that can continue what we do.
What does succession planning look like for you? Are you ever going to retire? You're not allowed to.
No. What to do what?
To do what? Exactly. How boring.
We have the best life as it is.
Absolutely.
We're shopping and talking and spending time with people and just enjoying the quality of life. So I certainly don't see retiring. Obviously, it can be a little bit more selective and with the projects, but travel is just so innate to me. It's a very important part of it, and just keep nurturing the team. I'm there for them. That's what I want to remain.
What do you hope people will remember about your work? I mean, it continues, of course, but what is the essence of Thomas Hamel and Associates, and what do you want to be known for?
From the days of Parrish-Hadley, I learned that, to try and avoid gimmicks and the trends. And unfortunately, we're inundated by that now because that's what everyone's got an Instagram moment. And, if I see another arch or another this or another that, it's overwhelming. And it's going to be, that was, 2025.
That's right.
And I tried very hard to avoid that, but at the same time staying fresh and contemporary. And I'm very proud when I flip back through my book and think that book from 15 years ago still feels as fresh as it did then. So relevant,
absolutely.
So that's a great. It makes me feel very good.
Can I ask you a question? Because I'm really curious about this. We're talking about trends. I know I'm meant to be wrapping this up, but I haven't. Because I'm really interested in this idea of trends, and we open our Instagram, our Pinterest, even the magazines, and there's a language around those trends, and it's so focused. And how do you, as a practice, I guess, walk the tightrope, because you can pull elements of, but the challenge, I think, is that, magazines and are focused on a look that they're trying to sell a magazine.
And the products advertised in the magazine.
And the products advertised, exactly. And that's absolutely what they should do.
Yes.
But I think if
So
you're
we want
trying
them to survive.
We want them to survive. We need them to survive.
Absolutely.
Exactly. But we are inundated with digital images all the time. And as a practice, how do you walk the tightrope of maybe pulling influence but staying true, and not, I guess, creating the spaces to get the published work, to get the image, because it becomes a vicious cycle, I think.
Very much.
And I think it's I think about this all the time, because I don't design from a place of, it's very much about, similar to you, the client, the needs. And I don't want to look at a space that I designed in 5 years' time or 10 years' time and for it to feel like it was of a particular moment.
Exactly.
So what's the advice? What is the advice for us?
Well, it's tricky. It almost goes back to your question about, how do you find interesting vintage things or antiques or even contemporary things, because that's the biggest issue I find with when I look at the local work, is that everything's come from the local stores. And so that's why they all start to blend together. So that's why I'm always trying to throw in something that's, found here or found from there, so that they do have that bit of unique to them. And,
that's right.
And that's all I could say is a good thing to try and do. But then it comes with the issues of, first making sure it's the right size when you see it online somewhere else, and the shipping complications, etc.
Right.
But
because if you look at your book, every single project is different.
Yes.
But it feels layered and feels refined and curated and
a home.
A home, exactly. 2 more questions.
Okay.
If you could whisper something to your younger self, what would you say?
Continue to do what you do, but remember and just engage even more so. I would love to. There's so many periods and things that I didn't engage enough or get involved enough, asking enough questions to actually get to where I am. But I feel so content at where I am in the world. I love being an Australian. I feel very special being here.
It's an honor to have you. Our very last signature question that every guest gets asked: what does Build Beautiful mean to you?
For me, no matter if you're building a home or an office, a career, the most important word and what is required the most is passion. And I think you've seen that I have passion, and everyone that I've mentioned today that has influenced me over my time had this passion that I've tried to take from theirs and build mine.
Beautiful. Passion. Right? Love it. Thank you, Thomas. What an honor. Honestly, it has been the most amazing conversation. I'm so grateful to you. To be continued. We have a part 2, everyone. Thank you so much, honestly. I'm so grateful.